Alrighty, so for this first learn together of our section 7, so section 7 is really, in some ways, we've covered, but I really, as I rewatched this today, was appreciating how well he talks about the HTML. He does talk about setting up the web server, which I've talked about before. Again, I want you to know this is not required, but it is definitely a good thing to have. I had already talked about prior, so I'm just bringing it up again, that you can open that index.html file in your browser, or you can also, if you're not comfortable doing a command line install, you can also go down to extensions and select live server from there. So there are many ways you can do this, but I want you to know that running a live server is a good idea, because it's something as you move further into coding, you're going to want to have that have that set up. But for this week, as long as you do what we've already been doing, which is loading the index on your local browser. And do let me say as well, and this is a good time to remind us all of this, when you're running local, right? So the git hack link that you use when you share your code with everyone else is not the code you use is not the way you look at your local code. Okay. So if I was in this folder, open here, right? Then of course because I have it installed, could run live server, but I could also just navigate to this folder, which this is the folder you want to set up for this week, and load the index file. And anytime I would change the app.js, do that as well. So by the way, I also recommend, and I want you to have your files named as I have them for our learn together, which is the index and the app.js, because I know that he does in his notes dash app.js, which is fine for what he's doing, but for our work, I want to make sure you name those. And for the most part, you all have been naming. So let me just show you what you're going to be doing this week. And I've given you the write-up, but let me first show you is that now what I want you to do is create the button, because now we've learned how to create buttons in the HTML. And as important, more important, we've learned how to write event listeners that listen for, in this case, a click event. And when that click event is activated, it calls the callback function. And in this case, what I want you to have is just the output from what we had for our last learn together. Now, at this point, we've jumped over week 3 through our first code review, and I haven't had any yet, so I can't talk about them. But it would be taking the code that you did for week. So we're in week 4, but in week 3, learn together and get it working here. Now, actually, let me be even more specific. What you're doing here is where you had the show on page before. I want you to no longer use my function, but use what you've learned so far in this section for actually creating your output. Okay, because he shows text content. That's just another way to do it. There's benefits to doing, and what I'm looking at here is where you're creating the new paragraph. But again, I want you to take your code, implement where you were using show on page to actually write the code that outputs to the page itself. Okay. Now you can still do it in a function. That's okay. But let me scroll down. I'm not going to show you all my code, and I'm actually not going to push it, but I just want you to see, in my case, what I've done is here's my event listener. Now, what I've done it on the button. Okay. Add an event listener. In this case, the E is the event. I'm actually not using any of the thing on the E, so I could drop that. But this then would replace where I was calling I don't even know if I have it here anymore. Yeah, so where I had processed my data before, this would now handle that, because nothing's going to process. Now, if I click it again, it processes again. That's something you definitely could make clear this after you do it again. But for this week, just getting this working is fine. Okay. Now, the other thing, and he talks about it right at the end of this section, right here on the advanced queries. And you can see that in my setup, I've actually done this. This is very common, and I recommend doing this is where you're going to place or point to. That's kind of the way I think about this. Document dot query selector, in this case, output points to that output and that div, that ID. And before this, he's been using body in order to just update in the general DOM body. But it's more common to actually have a place that is either a class, which he shows, or in this case, I'm going to use an ID, right? So this ID, so this pound sign indicates that. And again, he talks about this, but I just want you to know I tend to declare and assign this out on the global space so I have access to it whenever I want my code to output, and in this case, to that particular div. So the work you have to do this week is take the output you had from the previous week's Learn Together, implement a button, write an event listener that outputs your the content, the output of your code that you had used show on page before. Now I want you to actually write the code to update the DOM. Okay. So this should be a good exercise and probably shouldn't be a surprise where we're going next, which is actually to have you input values rather than just to process the data. And that I'll talk about obviously as I move into the next section. But I just for this week wanted to kind of say this is, you want to walk away with understanding these basic concepts of button, how to do them, event listeners, how to update your DOM with the data. In this case, we're iterating over, for me, an array of objects. Could just be an array, that's fine. But whatever you outputted, the key is, and I'll reiterate, don't use this anymore. Write your own code in your own way, of the way you want it to process. Okay. All right. I hope this helps you, and I'll talk to you later.